Human rights NGOs have overly expanded their reach, that they're no longer just trying to protect human rights in cases in which there are clear violations of human rights, but that they also have their own agendas, basically crossing from being protectors of human rights into something which could be more called as an advocate or a lobbyist with a clear political agenda.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Helena Ivanov says non-governmental organisations face an existential threat.
The overwhelming feeling is that these NGOs are way more accountable to their donors rather than to the people and the communities that they're meant to serve, and that this is becoming visible in their day-to-day operations.
Helena says the gap left by failing NGOs is an opportunity for authoritarian regimes.
On one hand, the West is losing control and influence that it has in Africa. At the same time, Russian and Chinese companies and businesses that ultimately arrive do not consider human rights or environmental standards or workers' rights in any shape or form close to what the Western company or business would do.
And that this is part of a wider rejection of Western values.
This disillusionment with the West is something that authoritarian regimes, and specifically Russia and China, are able to utilize quite a lot. And I think that's another reason why all of us should really want for human rights NGOs to reform in a way that helps them rebuild trust.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Helena Ivanov, Associate Research Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. Helena, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
So we're talking today about human rights NGOs and this collapse in trust. Before we get into the details, could you give us a brief background on how these NGOs came about and how they contribute to our world?
Well, actually, human rights NGOs have existed for more than a century, but I would say that they really gained their prominence and relevance in the aftermath of World War II, when, the human rights and the protection thereof becomes one of the key tenets of the geopolitical world order that we've lived in. And in the many years since, the NGOs have really been exactly what they were intended to be, the key protectors of human rights across the globe. They one of the cases that we mentioned quite a lot in the report that we've launched looks into the role of Helsinki Watch and everything it's done in the former Soviet Union to protect all of those whose human rights have been abused. On top of that, we also discussed the formerly known Anti-Slavery Society, nowadays known as Anti-Slavery International, and everything that they've done to basically abolish slavery. And of course, their shifted focus right now on more contemporary challenges as slavery is abolished across the globe. And I think that their importance and everything that they have done really means that this sector needs to remain as strong as it once was, and that we need people to believe in this sector and to value and appreciate this sector as much as they have in the past, because NGOs have done a lot for advancing human rights, particularly for disadvantaged groups like women, LGBT, people of various racial minorities. So I think they really have proven themselves over the many, many years. But unfortunately, in the last few years, they are increasingly facing a crisis of trust, which really threatens to undermine everything the sector has done in the past on one hand, but also simultaneously it really threatens their ability to do their job effectively going forward.
Right. Yeah, so you've published this report that talks about the crisis of trust. Can you explain it to us?
Well, basically, the report sort of starts with this idea, that human rights NGOs really matter, and the report really provides a lot of detail into all the things that human rights organizations and NGOs have done in the past, both which aimed to advance human rights across the globe and also protect human rights in instances where they have been violated. However, what emerges in the report is that in the last few years, people have stopped trusting the NGO sector, with many different accusations around NGOs occurring from various sectors. One of the major cases that's often mentioned is Israel, obviously in the context of everything that's happened in the aftermath of October 7th, but also even prior to the October 7th attack, many have raised concerns about whether NGO sector really is impartial when it comes to Israel, whether the NGO sector perhaps is leveling way too many critiques of Israel as opposed to some other countries that exist in the region. Similarly, in Africa, many have said that basically NGOs, major human rights NGOs in particular, are often not really cooperating with local organizations, that they often come across as more responsible and more accountable to their donors rather than to the people in the communities that they're meant to serve. Others have said that basically human rights NGOs have overly expanded their reach, that they're no longer just trying to protect human rights in cases in which there are clear violations of human rights, but that they also have their own agendas, basically crossing from being protectors of human rights into something which could be more called as an advocate or a lobbyist with a clear political agenda. Now, the report itself doesn't necessarily try to evaluate the validity of these criticisms. So we're not saying that we agree with these criticisms, but what we're saying in the report is the sheer amount of these criticisms that are appearing, the number of different stakeholders that are now making such accusations and criticisms towards NGO are clearly showing us that there is a crisis of trust. And this is also backed by data. Multiple different organizations that we cite in the report have done polling across developed countries, across developing countries, basically asking them, do you trust in non-governmental organizations? And we're seeing across developed and developing world a decrease in this trust, which is quite unexpected. In both developed and developing worlds, we're also seeing a huge decrease in trust of governments. And usually when there is a decrease of trust in governments, you expect NGOs to benefit from that and for trust in NGO sector to increase. But we're not seeing that right now. So basically the report is saying, at this point, it no longer matters whether these criticisms are true. The NGOs have to do something about this. Otherwise, they really face issues going forward.
Right. So how have the NGOs responded? Do they agree with the problem you've identified?
Well, it doesn't seem to me like they necessarily agree. So far, ever since the report's launch, we haven't really had the chance to engage with many NGOs for whom this report is written for at the end of the day, and also on the basis of what we're seeing in terms of what they have done in the aftermath of the report that we've launched, or in terms of like the criticisms that we're hearing about the NGO sector. I wouldn't say that much has changed, unfortunately, and I think this is particularly problematic because if we take into account the new administration that we have in the White House, the NGO sector faces yet another threat. Donald Trump, even in his previous term, has been quite open about his idea to name certain NGOs as anti-Semitic. He was making suggestions that maybe he will name Amnesty International as anti-Semitic. He hasn't done that, but he's nevertheless suggested he may do that. Since assuming office for the second time, President Trump and his administration has made it very clear that he's not very favorable towards the NGO sector. The shutting down of USAID is basically, going to shut down a lot of different NGOs that in part or completely depended on USAID's funding. So I think, the NGOs now face, I would say, even an existential threat. On one hand, the people, the very communities that the NGOs are meant to serve and protect no longer really trust the NGO sector. It's not just the people in the communities. A lot of different experts, the founder of Human Rights Watch is also one of the people who has written a very long op-ed many years ago, basically saying that he's very disappointed in what his organization is doing. So it's not just the people and the communities, it's the experts, it's the policymakers who are increasingly not trusting the sector. But then at the same time, the second threat the NGOs are currently faced with is the new administration sitting in the White House, which is going to create obstacles for NGOs to do their jobs effectively. So really, I think this is the last call for the NGO sector to wake up and to do something about it. At the very least, resolve the crisis of trust that it currently faces, so that it can get back the support from the people, the community, the experts, and other organizations that are relevant for NGOs' ability to operate effectively. I think that would definitely really help the NGO sector at this point in time.
These organisations were once kind of proudly unbiased and didn't take either side in anything. In your opinion, what went wrong? How do we get to this point?
Well, I think if you were to sit down and interview members of non-governmental organizations, I'm sure that a vast amount of their employees would still tell you that they are being impartial, that they're not choosing sides, that they're not being biased, that all of these criticisms are not, made in good faith. But the report that we've written basically says it no longer matters whether in reality you are being impartial or you're not being impartial. If so many people around you, and mind you, these are the people that you're meant to serve, that you're meant to protect, who are meant to support your work, if all of these people are saying we no longer see you as impartial, then it doesn't matter if you are or aren't impartial. Because if these people don't trust you, if these people don't want to work with you, if these people don't believe you have a legitimate authority over the topic that you're discussing or rights that you're trying to advance, you're not going to be able to do your job effectively. So at this point, I would say it doesn't matter what's the actual state of affairs. It also doesn't matter what the people working at these organizations believe. It doesn't matter even what the people working at these organizations, are trying to do. Maybe they're doing their best to be impartial, but clearly the feedback that they're getting is saying this is not enough. You have to do more and you have to do better if you want to earn the trust of people. And, we've seen this with, say, Amnesty International's report on Ukraine, where they've written that report that like Ukraine's war tactics endanger civilians, which then many have said, well, is this the right time to have such a report published? We've also seen a lot of such criticisms that are basically saying that NGOs are overly focused on what Israel is doing or has done even before October 7th in comparison to other actors that and states that operate in the Middle East. Now, maybe some people from these NGOs would tell you, well, we think that these are the issues that we need to highlight. We believe that in these circumstances, there have been human rights violations. For all we know, they could in certain cases even be right. But the point is to say, if people don't trust them, if experts, many experts don't trust them, that means that they haven't done their job adequately. Because part of protecting and advancing human rights requires that you have the authority and the confidence that you're able to advance and protect human rights. If you don't have that, then you're not able to do your job effectively.
Do you think this is a kind of mission creep there, becoming almost activist organizations?
I definitely think that many people perceive them as such. I think more and more people and experts, we cite a lot of that in our report, are basically saying that they no longer perceive human rights NGOs as these impartial organizations that are trying to advance human rights or offer assistance to people and communities who need their rights protected and advanced, but increasingly basically are saying we see human rights NGOs as activists. And I think that is a very dangerous zone for human rights NGOs to find themselves in, because one of the key things that helped them advance and protect human rights in the past was that they were basically seen and accepted by everybody as impartial organizations that had a very clear, narrowly defined focus and were able to deliver the outcomes effectively. And I think right now, with them being increasingly seen as activists, it's going to become more and more difficult for them to do that.
It seems the issue of Israel is so divisive in many areas of our society now. Can you talk a bit more about how it's functioning here?
I would definitely say that the key, most contentious, most controversial issue pertaining to trust in the NGO sector definitely comes from the conflict in the Middle East and the positioning of non-governmental organizations towards Israel. In the report, basically, one of the huge case studies that we cover, one of the key case studies that we cover when it comes to elaborating on this argument that there is a crisis of trust is Israel, because we can basically see huge, vast amounts of criticisms towards NGOs coming from the people of Israel, the government of Israel, many different experts and policymakers who are not even necessarily Jewish or Israeli, who are all saying the NGO sector is unfairly and unjustly targeting Israel. For example, we cite quite a lot of data from NGO Monitor, which is basically a think tank that looks across various NGOs and the way in which they report specifically about Israel and the Middle Eastern conflict. They provide quite a lot of stunning data and criticisms targeting the NGO community and the way in which they have conducted themselves when it comes to Israel. And I think right now, if you look at what is going on in the Middle East, this is clearly one of the regions where protecting and advancing human rights right now is absolutely crucial. Whenever you have a war, you're bound to be very close to substantial and severe human rights violations, and you really need NGOs in those kinds of contexts. That's the key place, I would say, where you need NGOs. You need them to see if any violations are taking place. You need them to advocate for people whose rights are being violated. You need them as reporters, to provide evidence eventually. Like we've seen NGOs do this in some other conflicts. However, the way in which this is playing out in the Middle Eastern context is that NGOs have lost trust, they have lost credibility. Again, the report is not evaluating the validity of these criticisms. Like we're not saying, yeah, these criticisms are accurate, or no, these criticisms are not accurate. But what we're saying is basically, look, there is just so much of it that NGOs cannot do their job effectively in the context of the Middle East anymore, because whatever they say and whatever they publish, key stakeholders are very likely not going to trust their findings. And this is a problem because we're basically speaking about a region that is now in an urgent need of effective human rights NGOs engagement.
So your report also highlights this increased perception of double standards. Can you explain that to us?
Well, basically, Israel is the context where people are saying that those double standards are most obvious. Basically, what the critics of human rights NGOs are saying is the kinds of standards that are currently being applied to Israel are not necessarily being applied to other actors in the Middle East, and specifically actors that are in some shape or form direct or less direct conflict with Israel. And that's the key criticism that is being leveled against the NGOs in the context of Israel, that there are double standards. But I think this story is in a way applicable even more broadly. Like, for example, some of the other criticisms that are emerging in the context of Africa is that part of the reason why generally is increasingly losing its foothold in Africa and losing it to Russia and China is because of human rights NGOs who often require very high standards of Western companies and businesses who want to operate in Africa. In many cases, fulfilling such standards is borderline impossible. Western companies and businesses and they're forced to basically withdraw, and Russian and Chinese counterparts basically fill the gap. And obviously, the overall outcome is worse for everybody. On one hand, the West is losing control and influence that it has in Africa. At the same time, Russian and Chinese companies and businesses that ultimately arrive do not consider human rights or environmental standards or workers' rights in any shape or form close to what the Western company or business would do. So basically, there is this argument, if you want to apply all of those extremely high standards against Western companies, you're basically expected to do the same in the same amount, in the same size, with the same volume, so to say, towards Russian and Chinese companies.
These large NGOs obviously need funding. Is the desire to please funders also affecting trust as well?
Yes, and that is one of the key criticisms that is emerging when you think of the context in Africa. Like in the report, for example, we survey quite a lot of organizations and experts in Africa who are basically discussing the role that NGOs, especially major international NGOs, are having in Africa. And one of the key things that is often being highlighted is that the overwhelming feeling is that these NGOs are way more accountable to their donors rather than to the people and the communities that they're meant to serve, and that this is becoming visible in their day-to-day operations in terms of like the agendas that they have, the priorities that they have, the people that they hire, the way in which they operate, the way in which they work. Again, the report does not delve into like the accuracy of the claims that are made, but the fact that there's so many people and experts and organizations and articles written about this idea that international human rights NGOs are more accountable to their donors and the people in the communities in Africa that they're meant to serve tells you that people no longer trust these organizations. And again, this is an area where like adequate and effective performance of human rights NGOs is urgently needed.
I mean, some people may say, so what, let the NGOs decline. Can you talk to us a bit more about why it matters and what will happen to the communities that they serve?
Well, I think that if you look at the report and like we provide, as I've mentioned at the start, we provide quite a lot of insight into the role of Helsinki Watch in the Soviet Union and the Anti-Slavery Society, now Anti-Slavery International. And I think that really shows you that like when you have a group of motivated, enthusiastic people who want to advance human rights, who have a clearly, narrowly defined goal, who really take into account and into perspective the local needs and the local community's views, especially cultural views and political challenges of that specific context, you can really see how they can bring about a change, whether that's as it was in the past, abolishing slavery, whether with Helsinki Watch, all the things that we have seen and the ways in which they protected many activists across the Soviet Union, or for example, if you look at like many organizations that were fighting for women equality, you can really see how they've delivered change. And that's exactly the kind of thing that they could be delivering right now in the context of the Middle East, but also across many different African countries. But unfortunately, they're unable to do that, partly because the key stakeholders in those regions no longer trust them and basically think that the agendas and the priorities that they have are biased, politically navigated, largely determined by the donors and the funders rather than the actual needs of the people on the ground.
You talk in the report about authoritarian regimes seeing this as a bit of an opportunity. And can you expand on that for us and give us some examples?
Yeah, well, we're basically saying, the kind of example is what I've mentioned in African context. Like we're largely seeing the West losing foothold across the continent. We're seeing Russia and China filling in that gap. Part of this, we're saying, is rooted in this disillusionment with the West, which is in large driven by the performance of human rights NGOs, which are often seen as patronizing, often seen as an extended hand of colonialism, often seen as more accountable to their donors than the people in the communities they're meant to serve, and often ultimately seen as not really delivering the actual change that's wanted on the ground. There is a beautiful quote that we mention in the report that was given from a person from the developed world to Mr. Lawrence, who says, when we speak with the Americans, we get a lecture. When we speak with the Chinese, we get an airport. So there is this sense that, all of these international human rights NGOs, they come, they're not really aware of the political or cultural context where they are. They mainly come with, agendas and priorities dictated from abroad. A lot of what they do comes down to, a lecture, at least that is how it is perceived. And then you contrast that with China, that surely may not take into account human rights, workers' rights, environmental standards, and all the other things that are really important, but nevertheless, they give them something tangible, something they can see, something they can touch. And I think this disillusionment with the West is something that authoritarian regimes, and specifically Russia and China, are able to utilize quite a lot. And I think that's another reason why all of us should really want for human rights NGOs to reform in a way that helps them rebuild trust, rebuild this, confidence that people have in the sector, because ultimately they are part of this bigger puzzle of the disillusionment with the West that we're seeing across the world, which authoritarian regimes are using to their own advantage.
When America cut the US aid overseas programs, wasn't there a specific response from China on that?
We haven't necessarily covered that in this report, because at the time when this report has been written, we were only in the initial stages of shutting down of USAID. But look, the shutting down of USAID is going to shake this world unlike anything that we've seen more recently, especially in this sector. We're probably going to see many different organizations shut down, either because they depended on USAID funding, or a little bit more remotely because their clients depended on USAID funding and they're no longer able to afford some services. Of course, there are even more dangerous effects of the shutting down of USAID. For example, we know that many, I think The Atlantic reported on this, that many programs that were meant to basically give food to malnutrition children across the world are also going to be shut down. So I think this is going to be really like a tectonic shift in this whole sector. What comes out of it, up to a point, depends on what the U.S. administration's plan is, how much time is going to pass before they, somehow fill this void that's left by the shutting down of USAID. But I think we should, of course, anticipate that China is definitely going to try and fill that gap first, because this is the pattern of behavior that we've seen China do many, many years ago in many different areas. Every time the West leaves a gap, China's always standing there ready to fill it in. And I see no reason as to why the gaps left by the shutting down of USAID why China wouldn't behave in the exact same way like it did in the past. Obviously, do I think that any alternative that China is going to offer is going to be as good as what USAID was offering? I highly doubt it. I believe that it's going to come with a lot of strings attached, as we've seen, for example, with the critical minerals market, where, almost every assistance that China has given to certain countries, if they were rich in critical minerals, China wanted a bit of control over that, if not complete control. So I think any, aid that comes from China will come with strings attached. Do I think that Chinese organizations will place as much importance on human rights, workers' rights, gender rights, and environmental standards? Probably not. So I think a lot of this really depends on what the Western counterparts, and specifically in this case, the Trump administration plans to do.
Yeah. So looking more widely at this aspect of the regimes filling the gap, where do you think we will be in, say, 10, 20 years if we don't do anything about it?
Oh, I think we're going to find ourselves in a really, really different world to the one in which we live right now. I think already, China has shown serious propensity to threaten the global order as we know it. I think critical minerals might as well be seen as the new oil. At the moment, China controls 90% of processing of these critical minerals, 60% of the market in total. That's something where the West urgently needs to catch up. This disillusionment with the West is not solely linked to human rights NGOs. It seems to be covering all different aspects of Western operations and Western engagement in regions across the world. That's something where things need to shift for the better. I think a lot of this is also going to depend on, the current Trump administration and whether America first really means isolating America from all of these regions. Because if that's what it means, then yeah, I'm sure China and Russia stand ready to fill in the gap. And I think if Russia and China do fill all the gaps that potentially America could leave behind, yeah, we're going to live in a very different world to the one in which we live right now. And I think careful thinking, long-term planning is something which is long overdue. I think, for example, the aid data recently published a report showing that between 2000 and 2021, China has funneled around $57 billion into the critical minerals industry, which effectively gave it full control over critical minerals in at least 19 Belt and Road Initiative countries and around 160 countries across the globe, some level of control. This tells you that China had a critical minerals plan all the way back in the 2000s, and that it invested, almost quarter of a century into gaining this kind of control. That was long-term thinking. That was long-term planning. It gave it gave China a huge advantage in what is really a critical market right now. I think that kind of long-term planning is what the West right now needs. It needs to think carefully. How do we get people back on our side? How do we get the trust and the confidence that we somewhat lost in many critical regions? How do we position ourselves in the critical markets? How do we, whenever we want to leave from a market or from a country or from wherever we are leaving, how do we make sure that that gap isn't instantly, filled by China and its malign influence? I think a lot of that kind of planning is needed, or we're going to wake up in a very, very different world, um, 10 to 15 years from now.
So this is an issue that so many people have raised on my show, this idea that regimes, if you like, they plan for the long term, whereas our Western governments, it can be quite a short 4 or 5 year cycle. What can we do about this?
Well, obviously, one of the reasons why that's the case is because democratic countries, by and large, have elections every 4 to 5 years. And of course, there is the pressure on whoever is in power and obviously wants to stay in power. There is a pressure for them to address certain things in that time frame, which is from one mandate to another. Authoritarian regimes don't have to worry about that. Most of them basically have power for as long as they want to have power. And that's what gives them a strategic advantage to think long term. But I think, ultimately it comes down to each and individual administration or each individual cabinet to be aware that, sure, there are a lot of things that have to be done within a 4 or 5 years time. Of course, there is, you need to leave some space to plan for your eventual re-election campaign, etc. But I think if every single Western leader, set aside, say, 20% of their brain to just think about the long term, to think about beyond their mandate, beyond their political party being in power and going more into the long run, that would, of course, be a huge, huge change for the better. And this is not impossible. We are seeing moves in that direction in other industries. If you think about all the net zero initiatives that are being made, those are relatively long-term initiatives and relatively long-term planning in comparison to 4 to 5 years that we usually have between two election cycles. So I think that kind of logic, that kind of thinking, that kind of planning is something that we should be applying across different sectors, not just necessarily for achieving net zero goals.
So what can we do about the trust crisis with the NGOs? What are your recommendations?
Well, we basically give several key recommendations. The first one that we're saying is increase transparency and accountability across the funding and the operations. So, a lot of what we've said in this conversation so far is that people basically have doubts about who is funding all of these NGOs. NGO Monitor often raises questions of who is funding NGOs when it comes to the way in which they report about Israel. In the context of Africa, we've heard that many are saying organizations are more accountable to their donors and the people in the communities they're meant to serve. So we're saying, look, there's a very easy way out of this problem, which is just increase transparency when it comes to your funding, increase transparency when it comes to your operations more generally. Open the doors, allow people to come and see how you do your business. And I think that in and of itself is going to increase some levels of trust. The second thing that we're saying directly addresses one of the major criticisms. We basically say engage in better collaboration with local organizations as well as other key stakeholders to build community trust. On one hand, you obviously have this meta problem of trust, major organizations, major communities saying we don't necessarily have trust and confidence in the NGO sector. But we're saying start small. So wherever you end up setting up your business, try and work with these local people, because by getting their trust, you'll be able to do your job more effectively. And if you replicate this to many, many different cases, overall, you're likely to increase the level of trust that people and communities have in you. The third thing we'd say, again, addresses something which has been raised quite a lot of times in the context of Africa as a criticism. So we say greater flexibility in operations, adapting to the cultural and political landscape of the countries in which they operate. For example, in the context of Africa, a lot of criticism basically was saying that NGOs are just prioritizing advancing the liberal agenda way too much, given the political and cultural context in Africa, whilst obviously protecting, say, LGBT rights is really important. Maybe do it at a stages, do it in a way that's more adapted to the specific cultural and political context of the country that you operate in. Because if you allow for that kind of flexibility, you're more likely to get community trust, which in the end will get you to your ultimate goal, just in a better, more efficient way. The fourth thing that we argue in favor of is something which sort of touches upon what we've mentioned already, which is adopt a risk-based approach that allows Western influence, which generally has far more respect for human rights, to grow in countries that have poor human rights records, and basically prevent the spread of Chinese and Russian influence that has very little regards for human rights. So we're basically saying when human rights NGOs want to write reports that are targeting Western businesses or Western companies, of course they should do that. Everybody should be, held accountable for respecting human rights. But the way in which you do it, just make sure that this is a risk-based approach and make sure that the ultimate outcome isn't that Russia and China get to win this point, because they have no or very little consideration for protecting human rights. And then the final thing that we say, which is something that you could advise to many different sectors, not necessarily just human rights sector, is improved messaging strategy, so that you can communicate, so that these NGOs can communicate their plans and their values way more effectively. There have been a lot of accusations of political bias, of advocacy, of activism, of them not being partial. Like, if these human rights NGOs want to avoid accusations of political bias and avoid accusations of partiality in their operations, they need to communicate better. They need to explain why they're not being partial, why they're not being, activists for a specific side, but instead impartial organizations. They need better communication strategies, because I think a lot of the criticisms that we're seeing right now, if NGOs had a better strategy to engage with those, to explain those, to clarify those, probably the crisis of trust wouldn't be as deep and as big as it seems to be.
And finally, how optimistic are you that things can get better?
Well, I'm optimistic in a sense that I think this can be done. I'm optimistic in a sense that I don't think that this requires too much work. To the extent to which I am pessimistic, I think that across the globe, polarization is really becoming our zeitgeist. It is becoming increasingly hard for two groups that have opposing views to engage each other in a respective, constructive way. And in that sense, I'm worried that it will be hard for many NGOs to hear this criticism and then really incorporate it, because I think right now everybody is in a my way or highway kind of a mindset. So I think that really needs to change. I think we need more people who disagree to sit down, to have a normal, civilized conversation where both sides can express their views, where both sides can, at least up to a point, show understanding of why that other side has that different view. And that needs to be the starting point. I'm pessimistic that right now we're close to that point, which is why I'm pessimistic that some of these recommendations that we give will be implemented. But I'm optimistic because it can definitely be done. It's not rocket science, so to say.
Helena Ivanov, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.